this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader reading books for you. Today, I will be reading Chapter 2 from The Moon and the Magic Box by Michael Ross, illustrated by Magdalena Adic. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to the author for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 2, The Fireball. At the same time that all this was happening at the NSC, AFC, Troy and Desmi had spread out the bale of hay. Nesbit jumped into the middle of it all and began scrabbling away at it furiously with his front paws as if he was trying to bury a bone. Hay was shooting behind him and landing all over Troy and Desmi, who were now laughing. "Stop it, Nezzy!" shouted out Troy. For a second, Nesbit turned his head to see that Troy and Desmi were still laughing, and so he continued. In the end, Desmi grabbed and wrestled him to one side. "This is a great game," thought Nesbit, and began running in ever-accelerating circles around them both. And still, pieces of hay were flying up in the air. "Okay, Nezzy, enough," said Troy. The tone in Troy's voice warned Nezzy to behave, which he did right away, and sat down, panting. They all flopped down onto their backs and started gazing up into the night sky. It was warm and the sky very clear, and because they were away from any lights, their eyes quickly became accustomed to the night sky, so the stars seemed to pop out of the blackness. They all spotted an unusual speck of light that was moving down towards them and from left to right. At the same time, Troy and Desmi pointed up towards the fast-moving speck of light and said, "Look!" at the same time. They glanced at each other and laughed. Nesbit jumped up and sat on his haunches. He too seemed to be concentrating on the speck of light, which was growing larger by the second. What appeared to be a pinprick of light a few seconds ago was now rapidly growing larger, and with it came a sound almost imperceptible at first, but now becoming louder, a sort of whistling, whooshing sound. Nesbit was looking up at the rapidly growing speck of light, twisting his head to catch the noise as dogs do. Troy and Desmi were now sitting up. Troy was beginning to fidget a little, simply because he felt the object was aiming directly at them. Troy stood up, turned to Desmi, and said, "I don't think that is a meteorite, Desmi. To be honest, I have never seen one this big and aiming for us quite like this one. I think we should move." Desmi was still sitting and turned to look up at Troy. "Oh, calm down, Troy. It will come nowhere near us." She was smiling as she said this. It was typical Desmi. Never seemed to panic, ever. Her reaction made Troy frown a little. He found it mildly annoying at times that nothing at all would faze Desmi. And as always, Troy found himself having to explain to Desmi with a lot of arm waving and with a slightly raised voice that couldn't she see how large it was getting? Couldn't she hear the noise in the air? And couldn't she know that it was aiming directly towards them? And so Desmi casually pulled herself up, put her hands on her hips, looked at Troy and said, Okay, Mr. Panicky, I'm up. What now?" Troy exasperatedly threw his arms into the air and looked up into the sky as if looking for some divine inspiration. He looked back down at Desmi and said, "Okay, miss, cool as a cucumber sometimes. Just sometimes you need to take things a little more seriously." But all this banter between them was always light-hearted. From before they could remember, they were still in each other's life. When Troy was only 6, his father was involved in a head-on collision in his truck with a drunken kid, barely old enough to drive. It was discovered that the boy was driving with one hand, while preoccupied with his mobile in his other hand. His father's best friend was called Jeff Slater, and he was a partner in the farm that Troy's father owned. They were inseparable. Jeff knew that Troy's mom would need help to try to pick up the pieces and to try to make sense of it all. Jeff had a little daughter called Desmi, and so Desmi and Troy were left to play. Desmi's mother had died with cancer when she was 11. It was devastating to everyone, of course. But in many ways, it wasn't a long illness. She didn't have to suffer for too long. Some would say that maybe they had feelings of brother and sister for each other. They would refute this, always claiming they were the best of friends. And that was that. Meanwhile, Troy was still looking into the sky, urging Desmi to move to safety. Suddenly, they both felt the ground beneath their feet begin to vibrate gently. They looked down and noticed pieces of hay flicking and moving around. The smile disappeared off Desmi's face, and she jumped up. By now, Nesbit had also stood up, and he too was peering at the ground, twisting and turning his head from left to right, and began barking, more than anything to bring Troy's and Desmi's attention to what was happening. Troy reached down and ruffled Nesbit's head and said, "It's okay, boy." It was now the high-pitched whistling sound that caught their attention. The object was now growing even larger in size, and it was changing color, blue to purple to red, then yellow. Billowing out from behind it was a fiery tail of yellows and golds. Desmi was standing transfixed, looking at this rapidly growing fiery object racing towards them. Troy grabbed her hand and started running down the hill with Nesbit just behind. A part of Troy wanted to stop and see what was happening, but his sixth sense urged him to keep running. They could hear a crackling sound now and could even feel some heat on the backs of their necks and legs. The object shot past overhead, seemingly only around 50 feet above them. There was a blast of warm air that was following the object, and for a moment or two, it dragged Desmi's hair with it. They instinctively threw themselves onto the ground to see the fireball shooting into the edge of bramble wood, which was by now only a couple of 100 feet in front of them. There was a loud explosion, and vast mounds of dark, damp earth and pieces of tree bark were thrown into the air as the fireball made its way rapidly into the middle of bramble wood. Some of the earth, soil, and bits of pine tree began to rain down on top of them all. They quickly sat up, both of them holding their ears, trying to block out the sounds of the explosion. Troy, Desmi, and Nesbit slowly looked up as little clumps of grass and tree bark continued to fall around them. There was also the smell of pine oil and burning wood. Silence and a mist enveloped them, apart from the minute pieces of crackling wood bark that were on fire and floating in the air. They slowly picked themselves up and looked at where the fireball had landed. Ahead of them was a perfectly symmetrical half-channel gouged out of the earth and running in a perfectly straight line into the middle of bramble wood. Nesbit was the first to move and started to run into the wood. He didn't go far, though. He decided to stand still and bark continually at the smoldering trail ahead of him. Troy and Desme crept up tentatively behind Nesbit. They looked around in awe. The destruction was on a monumental scale. Trees fallen or broken, split, and burning. The smoke was making their eyes water and sting. They started to move further into the wood. Ahead of them was a glowing ball of fire. As they got nearer, there were flashing lights that attracted their attention, and they appeared to be coming from something half buried in the ground. They stopped, transfixed. Nesbit was a fraction in front of them, sniffing the air for some clue as to what it could be. But you could tell he was ready to bolt back the way he had come, if need be. It was Troy who moved forward now, a half step at a time. He looked around for a stick. He found one, probably 2.5 feet long, with the intention of prodding whatever it was half buried in the soil. He started to move forward. "Be careful, Troy!" implored Desme behind him. Troy turned around and, with false bravado and a nervous smile on his lips, said, "Don't worry, Desme. It will be just fine." By now, Desme had inched forward with Troy 2 feet in front of her. They could both see the object now. It was essentially a transparent box, around 3 feet square. The surface of the box wasn't just smooth. It seemed to be transparent, but it was what was inside that was very unusual. It appeared to be a collection of very bright, mini lightning bolts, whizzing around in a very haphazard way, but confined by a force field into this box-like shape. The edges of the box had dark blue mini strobe lights that were running in sequence along every edge. There was something else very strange indeed. It seemed as though the flashes of light within the box were speeding up for a few seconds and then slowing down, almost as if the whole of the contents of the box was breathing. There was humming emanating from the box as well, but not one-pitch humming. As they listened, the humming was musical. No discordant notes, a delightful, almost hypnotic collection of notes. For a moment, Troy and Desme were drawn to the musicality of the notes. Even Nesbit was quiet now, turning his head this way and that, listening intently. Troy inched forward with his stick, intending to poke the box. Closer and closer the end of Troy's stick came to the box. It was now only an inch away. He stopped and quickly glanced around at Desme, who now slowly shook her head from side to side, willing Troy to pull back. But it was not to be. With a final stretch, Troy touched the box. What happened next, they will remember for the rest of their lives. There was a blinding flash of light. Troy had connected with the box and was transfixed. The lid of the box separated. The whole of the top of the box rose into the air by only a few inches, but enough for a white gas to pour out. It was then followed by some blue, gaseous, tentacle-shaped fingers, maybe 5 or 6, that came over the edge of the box and rose into the air by about 6 inches. It looked like they were searching for something. The ends of the tentacles were shaped like snakes' heads, but completely featureless. They appeared to be sniffing the air. Then suddenly, as one, they all looked in the direction of Troy, and in a flash, they all accelerated towards him. Some of the gaseous tentacles went into his eyes, others in his ears, and one into his mouth. There was a loud electrical crackling noise, and Troy became lifeless and lay horizontally on the ground. Suddenly, what looked like hieroglyphics, mathematical calculations, images of planets and star systems began passing up through the blue gaseous tentacles and into Troy. His head was now cocooned with swirling lights. His body slowly began to rise into the air. At the same time, so did the box, until both Troy and the box were around 3 feet off the ground. Desmi was transfixed and couldn't move a muscle. Nesbit was now curled up into a ball with his paws around his ears. Desmi thought to herself, "What is that? I can see something moving inside the box. It has large yellow eyes, and it's looking at Troy. Why would it be looking at him? It seems to be pointing at him at the same time." Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for Chapter 3. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I've included links for me to find and purchase this book.